Both parties deprecated war. But one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came.
O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won.
This is the site of Abraham Lincoln's greatest triumph. The Union Army needed 4 years to cover the 108 miles from Washington, D.C. to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. While some, including Secretary of War Stanton, feared for Lincoln's safety, he went to the seat of Jefferson Davis's government less than 36 hours after the Confederate Army burned and abandoned the city.
His courage, I think, first of all, in going into the Capitol, is just amazing. Secondly, and not secondarily, is the symbolic impact of saying, here I am, I'm standing on your ground in your capital.
You want to have a sense of closure. What better way than to visit your opponent's capital?
In more than 225 years of American history, only one other United States president has visited the capital of a nation he vanquished by force of arms. With his 12-year-old son Tad for company, Lincoln spent a little more than a day in Richmond, landing about this spot in the James River on April 4, 1865. Accompanied by Admiral David Porter, 12 sailors, and then a welcoming crowd, Lincoln went to the Confederate White House, taking the opportunity to sit in Jefferson Davis's office chair. Over 2 days, he met with Richmond notables, and he also went to the Confederate Capitol building and Libby Prison, which had held Union POWs. There, he told a Union general how to treat the Confederates, quote,
"Let 'em up easy, let 'em up easy."
Capture the Capitol is a good way to go. Kind of like school kids playing capture the flag. You win the flag and hey, the war's over. You win the Capitol and that's probably going to take the steam out from under the rebellion.
10 days later, he was dead. And in 30 days, May 4th, 1865, he was buried after being assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Even Lincoln himself had said years before that killing him would be senseless. Quote, "I do not see what the rebels would gain by either killing or getting possession of me. I am but a single individual, and it would not help their cause or make the least difference in the progress of the war."
It probably hurt the South, because if Lincoln had survived, he would have kept his policy of conciliation. He wanted a policy of conciliation. He wanted to be generous.
We are now walking in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln, on the wooden sidewalk in front of the family's home in Springfield, Illinois, that he left in February of 1861 and never saw again. The journey that he started here ended up in the White House, with his victory over 3 other candidates in November of 1860. He was 52 years old when he took the oath of office, the culmination of a life that began in a log cabin in Nolan Creek, Kentucky.
You know, family members wondered about him because he read all the time and he was self-taught. I think I would describe him as a kind of genius, a first thinker. You know, part of what shapes Lincoln is internal, has nothing to do with the environment, but the environment shapes him in that he recognizes that he wants something better, larger.
As a young man full of adventure, he sailed a keelboat to New Orleans. But more prosaically, he was a storekeeper and a postmaster in New Salem, Illinois, as well as a rail splitter before becoming a lawyer.
There were no law schools at the time, so he apprentices and considers all kinds of careers, some of which he's good at, some of which he's not.
He got his only military experience as a captain in the Black Hawk Indian War and turned to politics, winning 4 terms as an Illinois state representative before being elected as a U.S. congressman from the Whig Party in 1846.
The people that gave a lot of support to the Whigs were the kind of local elites in every town. They'd be the evangelical leaders. They'd be the professionals and the entrepreneurs. So they were interested in having a government that would support them in their enterprise.
As a first-term congressman, Lincoln opposed the Mexican War. He went so far as offering his famous spot resolution, accusing President James Polk of misrepresenting the location of the exact spot where the war began to make it seem like Mexico was the aggressor. His anti-war stance was not popular back home because Illinois would benefit from the new land the U.S. would acquire by winning the war. He did not run for re-election in 1848.
I want to see the spot where the war began. I think you're lying to us. I think you provoked this war. When he challenged the president, obviously, that did not sit well with many folks in Illinois.
Lincoln returned to the law, and known as Honest Abe, the success he tasted in the courtroom led to material success in the upper strata of Springfield.
He really was a corporate lawyer is what he was. He represented railroad companies and places that paid him very large fees. He was not the everyday man's lawyer, though he did do some of that.
Lincoln helped form the Republican Party in Illinois as the Whigs' 20-year run as a major party came to an end.
For Lincoln, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, obviously, like for many Whigs, is a point of departure. And the idea that the territories are now open to slavery that hadn't been open before, Lincoln finds to be a betrayal of political trust. And so, becomes active, very active in the Republican Party by 56.
He argued against the pro-slavery Dred Scott decision and then came to national attention through a series of 7 debates across Illinois in 1858 with Stephen A. Douglas in a campaign to be elected as U.S. Senator. About 70,000 people attended these debates, with Lincoln arguing that there was a, quote, irrepressible conflict between slavery and democracy, while Douglas based his position on popular sovereignty, or the right of states to decide whether to be slave or free. Writing their own material, the candidates could jab with bare-knuckled oratory, as when Lincoln slyly allowed that Douglas's misrepresentations were like saying Lincoln advocated growing cotton on the green hills of Vermont or selling locally cut ice in Florida.
Both men, very, very effective and very, very good public speakers. Thousands of people in the audience, obviously no technology to make themselves heard, to address the issues. This is just amazing, amazing political campaigning.
Douglas retained his seat by a party-line vote in the state legislature, but the debates gave the previously obscure Lincoln national prominence.
And the fact that he is brought east and gives a speech that is widely reported in the press in the Northeast, and people are saying, well, this Lincoln fellow, not only did he challenge Stephen A. Douglas and give him a very good run for his money, but he is the real deal.
Republicans nominated Lincoln for the presidency at the Wigwam, a convention hall built next to the Chicago River. He won all the states entirely north of the Mason-Dixon line, getting 5 states that had voted for the Democrat James Buchanan in 1856 to switch to the Republicans. He was the leading individual vote getter, even though the other 3 candidates actually took 60% of the vote. In Virginia, Lincoln received a paltry 1.1% of the vote, and less than 1% in Kentucky. He wasn't even on the ballot in 9 other southern states. A head taller than the average man and having a high-pitched voice and a frontier accent, Lincoln was a natural politician.
He is, I think, along with Jackson, probably the master politician of the 19th century. These guys are very, very good at their understanding of the common man and relating to the common man.
After sneaking through Baltimore to change trains at Camden Station a day before schedule to avoid a possible assassination attempt en route to Washington, Lincoln mounted the Capitol steps in March of 1861, succeeding a Buchanan who told Lincoln on the ride to the inauguration how happy he was to turn the secession issue over to him.
Buchanan basically says, good luck, I'm out of here. I can't wait to leave here. This is your job now, it's your problem now. And Buchanan left him with a horrible situation. And Lincoln, to his credit though, stepped up and did what he had to do.
By the time he took the oath of office to become the nation's 16th president, 7 southern states had seceded, with 4 more leaving in the next 8 weeks.
I don't think Lincoln appreciated the depth of Southern intransigence, how much they were wholly dedicated to their way of life, and how willing they were to do whatever was necessary to maintain that way of life.
Look at his first inaugural address and listen to it. I mean, he makes it very clear to the South, you know, if you'll just give up a few things, we can work this out. You know, we can make this work. No, the South's arrogance got in its way. And so there's where the problem was, is their arrogance. If they'd been smart, they'd have made a deal.
In his first inaugural speech, he told those he called, quote, his dissatisfied fellow countrymen, that the issue of a civil war was in their hands, not his.
You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it.
O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills.
Despite ordering resupply ships to sail, Abraham Lincoln had no choice in April of 1861 but to watch Major Robert Anderson evacuate Fort Sumter after a 33-hour bombardment in Charleston Harbor, just 10 days after the president took office.
This gives him his window of opportunity now, because this is an open act of rebellion against the United States government. You've fired on federal property. This is defiance of government authority and allows Lincoln to do a number of emergency measures, including calling up men.
He does something that basically is unconstitutional. He calls for 75,000 volunteers, which basically is an act of war, kind of a declaration. Only Congress is supposed to be able to do that. But wars make imperial presidents.
As the clouds of war gathered, the Union and the South, both flushed with confidence, set out to face each other.
Obviously, one Reb is worth 10 Yankees. Southern boys are natural men. They know how to fight. They know how to use a gun. Northern boys are shopkeepers. They're pantywaists. They don't know how to use weapons. They'll run at the first sight of a real man with a gun.
The sections of the country didn't know each other as well as they should. And what they knew was based on stereotypes. Not all Yankees were shopkeepers. We now know that only a very small minority of families actually owned slaves. Most of the men who fought and died in that war didn't own a slave.
The North had huge advantages in men and materiel, having 4 times more men of military age and a gross national product that was 3 times bigger.
You can count the economic resources and the production of steel and the production of uniforms and wool and all the cotton and all the production of food. For an agricultural region, the North still outproduced them in agriculture as well, especially since you can't eat cotton or tobacco.
Between July of 1861 and September of 1862, Northern troops failed to knock out the smaller Confederate Army by taking Richmond. Lincoln became frustrated with the caution of his commanders. Some historians say initially the South was better organized than the Union Army, which kept its professional soldiers, like West Pointers, with the regular Army troops, instead of spreading them out across the Army to train ill-prepared volunteers.
The Confederacy distributed its professional soldiers throughout its force. So you may have a bunch of farm boys being recruited into a regiment, but they're being trained by a professional. Initially, that made a big difference.
To the disappointment of Northerners, the more populous and industrialized Union won only about half the battles fought in the war's opening year and a half. A vivid picture of the effect of failing to do better on the battlefield? The number of recruits dried up after the initial response to Lincoln's summons in April 1861.
He calls for 75,000 volunteers. He gets over 90,000. They're batting down the hatches to volunteer. And that dries up within a few months, especially by a year. A year later, by April, May, June of 1862, there are very few volunteers that are willing to step forward.
But Lincoln got a boost near the Maryland town of Sharpsburg at Antietam Creek in September of 1862 on the bloodiest single day of the war and in American history.
With these weapons, you don't have to have men standing in close ranks to get something done. These are not smooth-bore muskets. These are rifle muskets. You can be accurate. But they still thought that to mass fire, you had to mass men. And when you mass men, you get them killed.
With 23,000 casualties and 3,600 deaths on both sides, the Union stopped the Army of Northern Virginia from moving north as Lee tried to score diplomatic, economic, and propaganda points by invading a border state.
He can take them into Maryland and show that they can win, not just in the South on the defensive, but they can win on the offensive. And that challenge was met and successfully repelled by McClellan's army. And it's a horrific battle. The casualties are sky high.
The victory helped keep restless European countries from recognizing the South and allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation to take effect the next January 1st.
The symbolism of the Emancipation Proclamation, the redefining of the war effort in terms of this moral purpose of ending slavery, also persuaded the major European powers to step back from the possibility of recognizing the Confederacy.
All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free.
Every school child in America is taught that Lincoln freed the slaves. First thing you say Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Automatic. Abraham Lincoln never freed one slave. Not one slave did he ever set free in his entire political career ever.
The proclamation pointedly did not free slaves in the non-secessionist slave states of Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, as well as Tennessee, which was mostly under Union control.
He actually could have freed the blacks that had escaped into northern territories, but he specifically excluded them out of that. And in the border states as well, he specifically excluded them out of it too.
Had the Union not won the battle, the proclamation might have been seen as a, quote, act of desperation, unquote, rather than aligning itself with the rest of the world to support the end of the institution of slavery.
There are only 3 places on the planet that still hold other human beings in bondage by this time: Cuba, Brazil, and the southern United States. The rest of the world, which is not perfect, has moved on from that.
What that will do is contribute to the military efforts by dismantling a major piece of the Confederate war effort. Because all those slaves were supplying labor to supply food and munitions and goods to all those soldiers who were fighting.
The next summer came the turning point Lincoln had been looking for: the fall of Vicksburg in the West to the Union after a 6-week siege, and General Meade's victory in the bloody and decisive Battle of Gettysburg in the East, both within 24 hours in early July of 1863.
And Vicksburg falls with 30,000 Confederate troops, and it basically gives the Yankees control of the entire Mississippi River, which is critical, obviously, in controlling the West and supply lines for the South. The Gettysburg, in and of itself, again, is a stinging defeat for Lee. It's a battle he never should have fought.
Even though it took almost 2 more years to defeat the Confederates, these victories marked the beginning of the end for the South.
The northern industrial machine is now in high gear, and the southern cause is suffering from shortages of every kind. You simply cannot smuggle in enough to maintain the war. You know, you can't buy enough supplies abroad.
The three-day battle at Gettysburg led to 50,000 killed, wounded, and missing on both sides. Almost a third of the 160,000 men who fought there.
You simply don't launch frontal assaults against an open field, against men who are entrenched in 1863. The Army of the Potomac was a very good army, and this was simply an ill-advised decision, and Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia never recovered.
On December 19th of 1863, President Lincoln rode by train to help inaugurate the Gettysburg National Cemetery, just a few hundred yards east of the high point of the South's iconic but failed Pickett's Charge.
77 years ago, he was able to use words with a ringing clarity that could reach, as Thomas Jefferson would say, from the plowman to the professor.
We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth.
Starting in late summer of 1864, victories by sea at Mobile Bay, Alabama, and on land in the campaign for Atlanta helped push Lincoln to a huge electoral victory over the peace candidate, former commander of the Army of the Potomac, George McClellan, who hoped to get a large vote from his old troops.
But what they did not want to hear is that after all of this sacrifice, we're simply going to walk away from victory. You know, we've come too far to simply, you know, to say, oh well, and negotiate a peace.
Lincoln was running on a national union ticket that combined Republicans and war Democrats, like vice presidential nominee Andrew Johnson, the only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union. The incumbent won 22 of 25 states and 55% of the popular vote on the now famous slogan, "Don't change horses in midstream."
When soldiers went to vote, it was a landslide for Lincoln. Something on the order of 80% of soldiers who voted for Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party.
At his second inauguration in March of 1865, with the tide of war firmly in his favor, Lincoln was conciliatory.
With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan.
But, O heart, 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 O the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
After Lee's Army of Northern Virginia abandoned Richmond, it moved southwest, pursued by Grant's forces, until being almost surrounded near the town of Appomattox Courthouse. Lee and Grant met in the main room of the McLean House to sign the surrender that Lincoln had so long hoped to bring about.
Going to be a war where you essentially bludgeoned your opponent into submission. That's essentially what happened. They were starved out by the Atlantic seaboard blockade, and then superior numbers.
The Confederate soldiers were able to keep their mules or horses in an astute gesture in a war of uncommon brutality.
When we talk today about why is it that white Southerners still support that battle flag so much, why is it that white Southerners during the Civil Rights Movement were so defiant, in many ways they were still fighting the war. They were still resenting the Grant and Sherman who marauded through their landscapes.
Abraham Lincoln had such admiration for John Wilkes Booth's acting ability that he had invited him to visit the White House. A rabid Southern sympathizer, Booth had dodged the invitation, but he had been physically close to Lincoln while in the audience at his second inauguration and at a White House speech open to the public just 72 hours before the assassination.
Think of the pain and anguish it must have felt in the North to ring out bells for victory just about a few days before when Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. And then the leader of the Union armies, the political leader of the Union, to have died just a few days later.
Speaking from a second-floor window at the Executive Mansion of a possible state constitution to bring Louisiana back into the Union, Lincoln's words disgusted and inflamed Booth, because the document called for empowering the legislature to, quote, confer the elective franchise upon the colored man, unquote. Despite being engaged to the daughter of an anti-slavery former U.S. Senator, the horrified white supremacist Booth used a racial slur to disparage the idea as Negro suffrage. Having previously plotted to kidnap Lincoln for ransom, Booth now planned to have fellow conspirators assassinate the Secretary of State and the Vice President as well.
To sit around and think I'm going to kill Lincoln and that's going to solve everything? No, the war was over. The war was done. I mean, it was finished. That would have accomplished nothing. Now, killing him in 1860, well, that might have been a different story. You might have thrown everything into chaos then. But the timing of the assassination makes it just an act of a fanatic.
Booth knew that he would have his chance when he learned that Lincoln and his wife Mary Todd Lincoln were going to Ford's Theater to celebrate Lee's surrender by seeing the comedy Our American Cousin on Good Friday, April 14, 1865.
Lincoln is not the kind of guy who's going to gloat. That's not his persona. I think there is a sense of relief, a sense of self-satisfaction, an inner sense of joy that he's not going to raise his hands up in a victory, so he's not going to dance around the room.
Lincoln and his wife sat in the presidential box, accompanied by Major Rathbone and his fiancée. A familiar figure at the theater, Booth walked around the upper balcony early in the play's third act, in view of many of the 1,700 people in the theater, with Lincoln's bodyguard having carelessly absented himself from outside the box, and Booth knowing the script well. The actor waited for the largest laugh line of the play to mask the sound of his shot. Amidst the audience's laughter, he barged into the box to shoot Lincoln in the head with a .44 caliber Derringer. He then stabbed Rathbone and jumped to the stage some 12 feet, 8 inches below.
Or maybe you could call it a crime of spite. Like, you may have won this war, but I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your leader. But what impact could it have on the war effort? The war was already lost.
Our common wisdom is that after yelling Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, Booth broke his leg in the fall and dragged himself across the stage. But the official record says he exited in a, quote, stagey yet rapid stride. Booth escaped through a rear door of the theater to a waiting horse, turning right on F Street to start his exit from the city, talking his way across this guarded bridge over the Anacostia River. Meanwhile, the wounded president was taken across the street to a bedroom in the Peterson boarding house. The president was brought in with a pulse rate of just 41, and the several doctors who attended Lincoln all knew he could not survive the wound. Near the end of the 9 hours between the assassination and death, Mrs. Lincoln was banished on Secretary of War Stanton's order to the main parlor because he felt she was hysterical. Mr. Lincoln died at 7:22 in the morning, with 26 people listed as being in the small room. Such a crowd that no one is actually sure whether at the moment of death Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the ages," or to the angels.
Lincoln has captured our imagination because if you think about it in a very real sense, he is the last casualty of the war.
Lincoln was taken back to the White House after his death, where his body was autopsied. Mrs. Lincoln asking that the doctors cut a lock of his hair to give to her.
Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells! But I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
Some 2 weeks before his death, Lincoln had a disturbing dream in which he ran frantically through the inexplicably empty White House, only to learn from a blue-coated guard that the president was dead. Just as Lincoln had prophetically dreamt, his body lay in state in the recently refurbished East Room, the largest in the White House, which was open to the public on Tuesday, April 18th.
This is a president who had just been recently reelected by a significant majority. He was, in fact, beloved by many, and his tragic end and the way in which it came about was unparalleled.
The next day, some 600 invited guests attended a 2-hour funeral service led by 3 clergymen. While the distraught Mrs. Lincoln remained upstairs in the family quarters, the president's 2 surviving sons heard their father's eulogy. Quote, "He is dead, but the memory of his virtues is precious, and will be a power for good in the country, quite down to the end of time."
This single man, this lawyer from Illinois, whose whole experience in office was like 2 years in Congress, but he gets control of a country in total civil war, and he manages to bring it through and keep it together. That is greatness.
After the service, the coffin was transported before thousands up Pennsylvania Avenue to a Capitol draped for mourning. The cabinet met for a prayer service early on the 21st, almost exactly 1 week after Lincoln's final meeting with these top advisors at the White House.
He is not slick, he is not polished, but he has gravitas. He has a fundamental soundness about him that inspires confidence. Part of it is his size. It certainly is, and his demeanor. I mean, he's a man who walks, with determination, with strength.
His casket was then placed in the presidential railroad car that left Washington, with stops at such places as Independence Hall in Philadelphia and New York City, and state capitals in Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. The 9-car train traveled 1,650 miles at a speed of 20 miles an hour. It passed through 444 communities in 7 states.
Life moved at a slower pace. It was only appropriate that the man who had preserved the Union, that the entire nation got to say goodbye and pay their respects. I think that was an expectation for that time.
Ironically, early on April 26th, while the funeral train was in Albany, New York, Union soldier Boston Corbett killed the fugitive John Wilkes Booth near Port Royal, Virginia. At this building in Durham, North Carolina, just hours later, the largest capitulation of Southern troops occurred. General Joe Johnston surrendered almost 90,000 Confederate soldiers to General Sherman, leaving just scattered Confederate armies remaining in the field.
It was a huge economic loss, even as we're attracted to the war because of the bravery of the soldiers and the excitement of the time. But it was a huge blow to the nation. It took years to recover from it, and for that region, it took even decades to recover from it.
The train arrived in Springfield on May 3rd, at the Chicago and Alton station near downtown, and the site of the modern-day Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Close to 100,000 people were there to watch, about 6 times the population of Springfield. Passing the site of Lincoln's law office, 6 black horses pulled the hearse toward the city square. At the state capitol, Lincoln's body lay in state in the representatives' room, where in the next 24 hours, some 75,000 people marched past the open casket and an embalmed Lincoln whose face had recently been retouched. Then, exactly a month after Mr. Lincoln's triumphal visit to Richmond, the casket was sealed, and with a choir singing and a 21-gun salute, it was carried past Lincoln's home and on to this receiving vault at Oak Ridge Cemetery, where 6 clergymen officiated in a final ceremony. The Reverend Matthew Simpson said that never in history was there such mourning as accompanied Lincoln's final funeral. If we glance at the procession which followed him, we can see how the nation stood aghast.
This is the first time an American president has been murdered in office. I mean, they've died before, but this is the first time he's been murdered in office. And they're shocked by this whole thing. They've just gone through a horrible war. They're shocked by that. The nation is in a total state of post-traumatic stress disorder. Really, the whole nation is. So this was a way to vent that grief and to vent all of that.
Today, his body lies in the Lincoln Tomb, which was completed in 1874 and is the second most visited American burial ground. Also buried in Lincoln's crypt are his wife and 3 of his 4 children. Along with Lincoln, the Civil War took the lives of more than 600,000 Americans, both North and South.
Don't forget, America, that this was a bloody fight, but it was a bloody fight to ensure the end of a system that would subordinate one person to another.
The most revered Lincoln site, drawing some 6 million visitors annually, is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Here, the nation's first martyred president belongs to both the ages and the angels.